The Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 12th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus said, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give the dominion to you. Sell your possessions and give alms. Make purses for yourselves that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Be dressed for action and have your lamps lit. Be like those who are waiting for their master to return from the wedding banquet, so that they may open the door for him as soon as he comes and knocks. Blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will fasten his belt and have them sit down to eat, and he will come and serve them. If the master comes during the middle of the night or near dawn and finds them so, blessed are those slaves. But know this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, the owner would not have let the house be broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Some YouTube videos just speak to you, don't they? One of my favorites, aptly titled "Stuff Pastors Say When Writing Sermons," hits particularly close to home. As the video opens up to the preacher sitting in front of their computer, text message conversation bubbles pop up on the screen. "Hey, what are you preaching tomorrow?" "No idea, probably God." The video continues as the preacher pores over opened Bibles and commentaries. The Bible actually says that? I wonder what the Greek says. Boy, the lectionary sucks. I got nothing. And then this one, which more than just the preacher might be left asking after today's gospel reading. Talking about wealth and money again? Jesus. You see, this summer at St. Philip, I decided to shake things up in worship. I opted for the alternate set of first readings and challenged myself to preach primarily from those texts, the Old Testament texts, always read but too often neglected in Christian preaching. What I didn't realize is just how repetitive they would become. The first few Sundays were great. The story of Elijah's encounter with God on Mount Horeb, the passing of the prophet's mantle to his successor Elisha, and the miraculous and humbling healing of Naaman, signaling the outpouring of God's grace on outsiders. And then came Hosea and Amos, and now Isaiah. And all I have to say is that it's starting to feel a bit like I'm preaching the same thing. And even in our recent gospel readings, Jesus seems to offer little in the way of thematic diversity. It's almost like Jesus is a prophet too. Talking about wealth and money and social justice again? Yes. Last week, the rich fool, as some Bibles title the story, had so much stuff that he didn't know what to do with it all. And so he built more barns, bigger barns, just to keep all of his stuff in, all of which came as a mini parable in response to a request posed to Jesus. Tell my brother to divide the family inheritance, all of our stuff, with me. In this parable, after storing up all his stuff, the rich man dies, and what becomes of his stuff then? I don't think the parable is meant to be an indictment against having stuff, per se. Pastor Craig made that abundantly clear, that we all have stuff last week. But in the tradition of the prophets, I think it's meant to be more of a somewhat uncomfortable redirection of priorities. Do we selfishly hoard all of our stuff? Or do we use what we've been given as a part of God's commonwealth, caring for our neighbors in need and recognizing with gratitude the source of all we have and are? And then today, sell your possessions and give alms, Jesus says. And in the section just before that, he reminds us, do not worry. Consider the ravens and the lilies. How much more will God care for you, just as God cares for all creation? Taken together, these teachings invite us to reconsider the meaning of abundance, not as stuff or wealth or money to be hoarded for ourselves alone, as though there won't be enough to share, but with awe and gratitude at how much there is to share and to go around for all. Isaiah's audience seems to have lost touch with these teachings, and God's response leaves no room for ambiguity. What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, enough of your burnt offerings? Incense is an abomination to me. Their worship and ritual practices had become meaningless. Is it because God hates incense? Well, I surely hope not. But the answer, although a bit gory and brutal, lies in these hands full of blood. Not the blood of their ritual sacrifices, but the blood at the expense of mistreating the oppressed and the vulnerable in their midst. I cannot endure solemn assemblies with iniquity. Translation, no act of worship, no prayer, no ritual, not even incense can make up for how you mistreat people. God simply won't look the other way and ignore it any longer. Their priorities are misguided. Although their feasts and festivals do occupy center stage, is it because of their love of liturgy and pure-hearted devotion to God? Or are they trying to pull one over on God, to distract God from all that they haven't been doing? I've wondered a lot lately about what those outside of the church must see when they look in at us. We throw around words like discipleship and evangelism, and we yearn to attract more young people to our pews and fill our new member classes and Bible studies. And yet, for all our efforts at these aspirational mission statements of welcome and flashy social media posts, the payoff seems bleak. The new members are far and few between in all of our congregations, oftentimes only breaking even and making up for those who are no longer here. Back in March of 2020, you might remember it, when the pandemic interrupted nearly every facet of our lives and forced us to adapt in unprecedented ways, churches came up with some pretty creative solutions. We poured money into HD cameras and high-quality sound equipment for online worship. We quickly became Zoom experts for virtual coffee hours and Bible studies when many of us had never even heard of Zoom before. We held outdoor services and parking lot communion, even in bitterly frigid Midwest winters. For the last 2.5 years, it occurs to me that churches have gone to tremendous lengths to innovate our worship life. Church isn't canceled, we would say. It just looks different. So I have to wonder, against this backdrop of Isaiah, what if we put even half as much energy into things like seeking justice, rescuing the oppressed, defending the orphan, pleading for the widow, as we have into clever ways to make sure we can still gather for weekly worship? Which prompts even larger questions still. Why are we here? What does it mean to be the church? At the congregation I serve in Glenview, we have several answers to that question just outside of our sanctuary. You can see them every time you walk into our building, emblazoned on a rainbow-colored banner in the narthex. It says, "Be the church, protect the environment, care for the poor, forgive often, reject racism, fight for the powerless, share resources, embrace diversity, love God, enjoy this life." Surprisingly, there's nothing on that list about going to Sunday worship. Not that that list is meant to be exhaustive or that worship isn't important, but truthfully, most of our churches are really good at worship. It's the one thing that we seem to do really well, that we're committed to. It's one of the things Holy Trinity is known for. It's the first thing we figured out how to adapt and readapt repeatedly during the pandemic. Isaiah's audience seemed to be really good at that worship stuff too. So much so that it had become a distraction. It's not that their worship wasn't important. It's what their worship had become. It was ritual void of any concern for their neighbor, least of all those who were vulnerable. God's judgment, in the words of Isaiah, leaves no room for ambiguity. It's a scathing indictment of a people who had abandoned the heart of God's teachings. These words are a challenge, and they're also an invitation. "Come now and let's settle this," another translation offers. God's assessment of the situation is not up for debate. It is what it is, but it's not irreversible. God's people, however and wherever we gather for worship, are meant to be a demonstration of the justice and presence of God. This is why we worship. God calls us to be the church in all of what that means. God calls us to gather here for worship, around word and sacraments, to be fed and nourished. God calls us to confess our shortcomings, ceasing to do evil and continually learning to do good and to receive God's forgiveness. And God calls us out to seek justice and to proclaim God's reign of love, bearing witness to God's abundance and that there is enough for all.